I'm Alexandra Dane, and my relationship with David McFall is very interesting. I actually became his wife and gave him two beautiful children.
So I'm called Laura McFall because I'm his eldest child. I was born in 73 and I think he was about 53. So he was an old dad.
Came to England in 1962 and worked as an actress for about 10 years. And then I had a puppet company after that. The works of Churchill are very, very special. David had a commission to do his portrait in Roquebrune, which was Coco Chanel's villa. A couple called Wendy Reeves and Mr. Reeves owned it. And Churchill used to go down. They used to love going down there to stay because they were lovely people and he was on his own, so he could misbehave if he wanted to, or not misbehave, or have fun. And that's where David did the sittings, and that's why the portrait is called the Roquebrune head. And he did the sittings in Coco Chanel's villa in the south of France. Then that was all in clay and all wonderful, etc. Of course, he stayed there, so every night there were different people, poets and artists and politicians, whatever. And Churchill found that fascinating, and that's why he loved being there, because of the society of people in the south of France then. When David had done it in clay, he then had to cast it. He couldn't bring it back on an aeroplane. It was in his car because the clay would have bumped up against something and the nose would have gone off. So in his hotel, he also had a hotel where he could put his equipment. He then decided to cast it into a mold. Now what they do is they throw white plaster at the portrait right into all the holes very, very carefully. And then that's like that. And there's a shim round which is dividing it into two. Then they take that in half and then they make the actual mold. It's very messy anyway. So there he is in his hotel room when he's done the portrait, flinging this plaster. And of course the maid opens the door and she really actually fell back and landed on the floor, like almost fainting to see somebody doing this in a hotel. He'd covered everything. But nobody throws plaster around in a hotel room in the south of France. Anyway, he then wondered, shall I go on doing this because the plaster's drying, or shall I pick the maid up? He had a bit of a thing so he thought, I'll just do one more and then I'll pick the maid up because she really had fainted. So that's, and then he brought the mould back to England and then it was cast into bronze. But he had lovely time sitting with Churchill and talking to him, not about politics or the war, things like, he said to Churchill, why did you take to painting? And Churchill said, I can't do his voice, but he said, when I was no longer needed by one government or another, I took to painting. That's how he started. And he told David really funny stories, and they killed themselves laughing. And David kept saying, look, we must stop laughing now because I can't do the portrait because you're smiling too much. So, but he had a lovely time, and that's called the Roquebrune head. Then it came to England, and there's the Tate have a thing called the Chantry Bequest, and they desperately wanted this portrait. But the Chantry Bequest says that the portrait must have been made in England, or the work of art. So then it was exhibited, etc. And then he did the big statue at Woodford Green of Churchill. And that is a huge thing. And when he was in Chartwell, because he did the sittings in Chartwell, Churchill's house, Churchill used to appear over a hill coming down towards him. And that's what David did for this Woodford Green statue. And Lady Churchill hated it. She said it wouldn't see the light of day, but it did see the light of day. I don't know why she didn't like it. Well, of course, I liked all the ones he did of my children, our children. And I mean, those are the most special ones to me of the children. But of course, I think he's a great, great sculptor, everything he did. I mean, in West Norwood, he did a huge statue of Oedipus and Jocasta. He was a fantastic carver. He could carve, he could do letter cutting, whatever. I mean, he was just extraordinary, because people who cut letters can't make portraits. I mean, you can't get, not the same man, which he did. I mean, his Vaughan Williams, I think, is absolute masterpiece. I still sell the Vaughan Williams, and I'm in about the second edition by now. But it is just extraordinary. And also, Vaughan Williams said, I can't sit for a portrait. I haven't got the time. So Ursula Vaughan Williams, who I knew, she said to David, just perhaps if you're on the floor looking up at him while he's composing, it won't disturb him. And so he was on the floor kneeling, looking up at Vaughan Williams composing. And that's how that portrait came. But his portraiture was absolutely amazing. And when he was about 18, he did a portrait of his sister. I mean, you can see that on his website. It's incredible at that age. You can't do things at that age. I think the anecdotes were all stories and fun, nothing to do with the war or Hitler or anybody. It was all just fun things. What we're having for dinner, and wasn't the dessert last night absolutely incredible? Those sort of conversations I think they had. Now, I'm sure they had more conversations in depth. They certainly discussed sculpture, the history of sculpture, and Michelangelo and the ancient Greeks, and what the ancient Greeks gave to the world. I think that was very important for both Churchill and David. Apart from democracy, the Greeks invented cement. The Romans say they did, but they didn't. It was the Greeks. And David went down to Athens, and he stayed there for 5 months, and he made copies of all the great sculptures of Phidias. And funnily enough, he loved the Parthenon. But when we were in India once, and we looked at the Taj Mahal, he said, it makes the Parthenon look like a garage, looking at the Taj Mahal.
So when I talk about my dad to friends, they can't kind of conceive what it was like, because it's, when your father's a sculptor and he walks in and he's covered in dust and he wears strange overalls and he's just making a cup of tea, to me that was totally normal. I went to quite a posh school in Sloane Square, and all my friends' dads were, I don't really know what they were. Were they diplomats? Were they bankers? And they wore suits and they went to work and they came back. My dad was always around. There was a sense that he was always around because his studio was in the back garden. And my parents only bought the house in Fulham because it had a studio. There was no other reason. It was a lovely house, but it had the studio, a beautiful Victorian studio with these windows. So Dad was a presence. He was a real presence in my childhood, but he was a quiet presence. He wasn't a loud man. He wasn't demonstrative. He wasn't a big ego at all. In fact, in terms of ego, I don't really know if he even had an ego. He was very, very soulful and quiet and selfless. So yeah, there was just this presence.
So he was a very, very depressed person. Any suffering that anybody was having in any country in the world, he'd really suffer with them. And he found that all very difficult. And he wanted equality for everybody in mankind, etc.
I think from quite an early age, I was quite fascinated with my parents' personalities because they were so different. And I'd go off to play with these other friends, and their parents sort of seemed to almost like be part of the same personality bubble. And I remember learning quite young the word extrovert and introvert. And as soon as I learnt those words, I was like, oh, that's it. My mum is an extrovert and my dad is an introvert.
When I met him, he was really quite depressed. I think I used to make him laugh and get out of himself a bit, but otherwise he would dwell on some really bad thing that was happening in some country. And then when we had the children, that was the first time he suddenly came, in my experience being with him, came out of himself, and this little person was looking up at him and fulfilled him and made him feel wanted. I don't know what it was. They changed his life, both of them, my son and my daughter, and he became a different person. he wasn't so obsessed with all the bad things that were happening in the world. And there were plenty of bad things, there are still. But he used to take that deeply into heart.
And even though he was very calm and very soulful, there were boundaries around me going into his studio, because apart from anything, it's a place of work. It was like a sanctuary. He'd have the radio playing, there'd be a wood-burning stove or one of those old coal, it was the 70s. And this sense of a kind of world of process that he did in order to, I don't know, slightly meditate into a space, or if he just did all of that naturally. So I couldn't just walk in there. And also there were figures all over the place. There was harmful stuff. You know, I could knock over an aperture and a piece of marble would fall on my head. So there were these goat bells outside the studio door, and the studio in the summery months would always be kind of open, the doors would be open. So you'd ring these goat bells, and then he'd know you were there and he'd come and let you in. And sometimes I remember he was quite a remote dad. So I think as a child I had to be quite creative to find ways to relate to him. Because I think he was, as Mom has said, he's a little bit like, oh my goodness, I'm in my 50s, I've got children, I didn't know this was going to happen. What do I do? So sometimes I had to take the lead, but as a child, you know, you don't always know how to. So I remember a phase of making a juice for him. And it was kind of a way that I not got his attention, but he really liked it, I really understood that. So I'd ring the goat bells and I'd have this juice and I'd take it in. And yeah, he was, so that's what he would do in the day. And it was, I guess it was really fastidious that the sun would come up, he'd go to work, he'd be in there. And then he'd come back into the family kitchen when the sun went down, and that was 6 days a week.
The other thing is he only worked in North Light. He couldn't ever work in electric light. And he always gave the eyes a rest at the weekend, because he said, I have to rest the eyes. His work was his all.
But he wasn't a remote dad. He was sometimes didn't quite know how to do the child-father thing, but he was really, really present in that he would cycle me to school on the back of his bike. And then I'd come down to breakfast, and he had this beautiful breakfast made for me, and my shoes would have been polished, but not polished in the way that other parents polish children's school shoes, polished as if they were a piece of art. So he'd stuff them with newspaper, and the stuffing was beautifully folded. And they'd be on a mat, and you could tell that he'd shined. It's as if the shining of the shoes was the loving of the daughter. And I think even as a young child, I really got those messages. I understood his love language. I suppose it got slightly trickier when I was a teenager. He didn't have a clue about that, but that's okay. Many parents don't know how to relate to their teenagers. But he was creative not only in his art. It was the shoes. It was the car he bought. It was never about status. It was about aesthetic. He was obsessed with Citroën because it had beautiful suspension, and it was a natural car that did this natural thing like flight. He was interested in aviation. So everything was about the sort of aesthetic or the mechanisms. And I remember really, really feeling that as a child. There was one Sunday lunch, and he wasn't a flashy chef. Anything that he made, you got the sense that it was to create a beautiful thing. His mashed potato was full of cream and salt, and it was just a beautiful thing. It was perfectly fluffy, and it wasn't about perfection. It seemed to be about this process of wanting to take all of these opportunities to be himself and to create. So anyway, this apple pie, I don't know if you couldn't buy homemade, shop-bought pastry in those days, so it must have been homemade pastry. And he'd put the top onto the apple pie, and then he'd made these leaves, and they were like pieces of art. They were carvings with the lines and all of the different veins that a leaf had. I don't know how long that must have taken him. I must have been 7. I mean, do you take that much care about making an apple pie for a 7-year-old? And it's just, so my childhood is peppered with these memories.
1 or 2 people wanted portraits who were actors, but I was in a lot of rubbishy comedies, and he loved being backstage. He loved the atmosphere of backstage, and especially I did a summer season in a place called Margate, and that's when we first got together. And there was a big space between the end of the set and the dressing rooms, and he used to stand there, and he loved it. He loved the whole feeling. It was a silly comedy, and he just sort of, the whole atmosphere of it, he absolutely adored. I don't think my acting, until I had my puppet act, I had a puppet act in my 30s in the theatre. He used to come to Theatre Royal Windsor when I was there. He loved theatre, but I don't know if it impinged on him all that much. I don't think my acting ever contributed to his work, because whoever he would have as making a portrait of, he would talk to you all the time, so you didn't fall asleep, one thing, and get round. And also certain people he wouldn't do at all because of their political beliefs, like the guy who bombed Dresden. None of the sculptors would do him. He was offered that, but he wouldn't, I mean, if he didn't believe in you as a person and what you stood for, he wouldn't touch you. Well, he didn't create the bronze, he created the clay. So you have an armature, and then you pack the clay in. And all he did was move round and round and round and round the sitter, all the little thing he was doing. And also, he just seemed to, the little figures in the bath, he just seemed to sort of make them, and they just kind of grew in front of you. Often at night, he'd be lying back like this thinking. And I think he was thinking of what he would do the next day, whether he would put the arm under the thigh or the knee up, or he was working it all out, because he wasn't thinking great thoughts. He was thinking of, and if I put that there, because when he actually started, he just did it. It wasn't a sort of process. It was there and inside him, and he just made it. And he didn't correct much. The shower figures or something, if it had been me, I'd be trying ages and ages to get the right curve. He just did it. Because he started making sculpture when he was very young at Birmingham Art School, when he was about 12, I suppose. And the teacher there taught him relief work, which he says the English never understand, but the French do. He did a lot of relief. And the whole thing about relief is to make it flat. Then it stands out. I mean, he taught me the whole technique of relief, and he loved making reliefs. Well, the truth in his work. It is very, there's nothing false about it. There's nothing put there for an effect. Even if somebody had ears that stuck out, which you think, oh, how are you going to do a portrait like that? Somehow, with the rest of the face, it worked. They didn't kind of stick out, or he was just a master. And especially with things like letter cutting and things, people like that can't do letters and make a nude all in the same. But he was very, very liberal in his political views. He was very left-wing, and he was always siding with the poor people, and he was always listening to the radio where some poor people were suffering in Afghanistan, or I don't know, some other country, and worried about it politically. He was very concerned. I don't think me in conveying or emotion through performance had an effect on him at all. Great theatre had an effect on him, but he didn't want to rush back home and start making a sculpture of it. He had his own huge thing about his own political views and what he wanted to say, which was very liberal and very left-wing and for the people, the people, the people.